Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some Coastal Fair Winds cards using the new Fair Winds collection from Spellbinders. That first die set there is called Guiding Light. This one is called Set Sail. And then the next one is called Oh Boy. Being an island girl, I live on Vancouver Island. I absolutely love anything coastal themed, so this is right up my alley. There's also a 6-piece layering stencil called Uncharted Waters, and it creates a beautiful background that I'm going to be using on all of the cards that I create today. But there are some components to the different die sets that you could use to create your own background if you want. For instance, in the Set Sail die, there is some cloud dies. There's some rocks in the Guiding Light one. I'm also going to be using the new guillotine trimmer from Spellbinders. This is a perfect trimmer for a card maker. You can easily cut an 8.5 by 11 sheet of cardstock in half to make an A2 card with a side fold. It measures just over 6 inches on the top and the bottom ruler there, and it's really nice and sturdy. I love that it has a little notch on the bottom part of the blade, so you can lock it in place when you're not using it. Another new tool that I'm going to be using today is the New Ultra Sticky Mat. I recently got it and it's going to be perfect for doing my layering stenciling for my backgrounds. Now I'm using larger pieces of cardstock for my stenciling. These are 5.5 by 8.5 inches. This is hammermill cardstock. You can use whatever cardstock you like for doing your ink blending or stenciling. The reason I'm using such large pieces of cardstock is I want to create the full 6x6 background from these layering stencils, and then I want to have the freedom to be able to cut it down where I want to when I'm creating my cards. I do have an idea where I want it, but I want to make sure that I have lots of room to be able to customize exactly which part of this background I'm using for the different cards. And I am doing at least one that is horizontal and at least one that is vertical. But I love the fact that you can easily create a beautiful coastal background. Now, because my cardstock is bigger, it's 5.5 inches wide, and this stencil is 6 inches, there's not a ton of room for that stencil to stick on my ultra sticky mat, but there is a little bit. But for the rock part on the left-hand side here, you can see that I'm holding it, and that's mainly because there's just a tiny little lip of that stencil that is on that grip mat or on that sticky mat. So that is moving around a little bit. You could use some pixie spray if you wanted to really stick it down temporarily to your cardstock while you're doing the stenciling, but it worked just fine doing this. The other thing with that first stencil especially is there's a really tiny narrow edge on the bottom. You could tape that down as well with some painter's tape, but because I knew I wasn't going to be using that bottom edge, if it wasn't perfect, it didn't really matter. So these stencils are all numbered on the top right corner, but it really doesn't matter if you're using them in order or not. If you're going through and using all 6 stencils, you're going to create the same background no matter which order you go in. So for the first water part there, I'm using distress inks. I'm using Speckled Egg and Tumbled Glass. For the rocks here, I'm using Lost Shadow. And you can see how easy it is to position and lift up my stencils just from that sticky mat. They're also very easy to position with each other and know exactly which ones go where and how they line up. For the sky, I'm just going to use some Speckled Egg, and I'm using a large ink blending brush with a flat edge just to do some quick ink blending. Now you'll notice I will hold down the left part of that cloud there because same as the rock on the bottom, it doesn't have very much edge of that stencil for that stencil to stick on the sticky mat. So it does lift up a little bit, but it doesn't affect the stenciling. I still love the end result. I'm trying to get the sky lighter than the water. I want to make sure that I have a definite different color for the sky and the water, but I didn't want to be using 1,000 different colors here. So I'm just using those same colors as the water, but I'm being a little bit lighter handed. Now I'm going in with some tumbled glass, which is also what I used on that first layer of the water. And once again, I'm being a little bit more light handed. I want to make sure you can still see that horizon line and that I don't have exactly the same color for the water as well as the sky. So now we can move on to the fourth stencil, and you can see there's several different clouds here in the sky. I did them all as clouds, but there's one especially on the horizon that you could, if you wanted, use some green on and make it some, or even some dark blue or whatever, make it some mountains or make it some like a forest or something. You can have a little bit of creative leeway there and change up the looks. Now I kept them as clouds because, again, I didn't want to use too many colors. I wanted the focus to be on the dies and the die cuts that I have on the front of the card, and I want my background to be kind of the background. I want it to be there and be beautiful, but I don't want it to take away from those die cuts. Now, I am using die cuts on all my cards, but you could easily use this layering stencil and create a beautiful background, add a sentiment, and have a card created pretty much. It creates a complete background, so it's not like it needs anything once it's done. And you can get really creative with different color combinations that you use as well. And the last card that I'm making, I'm going to do a little bit more of a sunset with it, so I'll change up the colors for that one. For this layer here, I use some hickory smoke to get a little bit darker shading on the rocks. And I also use that hickory smoke on the last layer with the rock shadows and edges. I did try to make sure that I had some lighter in some areas and some darker so that I didn't have all of those edges blending together. And the nice thing with ink pads, especially dye ink pads, is you can be heavier handed or light handed with the colors in order to get different shades of each color. And that way you can use less colors. You can get away with using less by being just strategic with where you use a light hand or heavy hand. This last layer here, I use the hickory smoke on the birds, and then I use some salty ocean on the last part of the water there, which is the highlight and the horizon. Before I get rid of my stencil here, I'm going to use some Stickles Moon Dust glitter gel on that water part. It's going to create a beautiful shimmer because it's got some beautiful glitter in it. And it's also going to add some raised dimension, and it's going to be glossy. So once I have that on there, I can take that stencil off and go clean off my palette knife as well as that stencil. You don't want to let any of that dry on your stencils. And I'm going to set this whole piece aside on my sticky mat to dry. I don't want to try lift it up off of the mat and chance ruining that glitter gel. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, I can assemble my die cuts. Now, I did all my die cutting for this off camera, and I have them organized in some medium craft stacks. That way I can organize them in different layers or different containers and know exactly what goes with what and keep everything organized. And once I have my pieces assembled, I can even put them in those craft stacks and set them aside and have them well organized and easy to grab. I'm assembling my die cuts with some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle, and I'm using a jewel picker to pick up some of the really tiny die cuts to place them. I may still have to lift them up and use my fingers to reposition it. By using liquid glue, it makes it really easy to move and shimmy things into place and have perfect placement. And by using that fine line bottle, I can make sure that I only use as much glue as I need for the particular die cut that I'm gluing down. Now, these die cuts are really easy to position and know what goes where because there is some score marks that get made when you are die cutting that show you exactly where they go. The only exception to that are these logs here. There's no score lines to show you where the rope pieces go, but you can easily figure it out, and it doesn't matter if they're perfectly positioned or if you have them all different. I'm going to do 3 of these logs here, and I'm going to make sure that these rope die cut pieces are completely different for each one of them. I don't want to have them totally identical, and I love the fact that you can customize it and position them exactly where you want them. For this part, I'm using some tweezers to hold those die cuts. I found it a little bit easier to hold the tweezers and add the glue to them while I was holding them than it would have been to try to hold those little tiny pieces with my fingers and then add the glue. The other option would be to put a line of glue on that little wood piece and then use the jewel picker to pick up that die cut. But by using the tweezers here, I can lay it close to the die cut where I want it and then push it down when I figured out exactly where I want to position them. I wanted to add a little texture to my background for this card, so I'm going to use the Castaway embossing folder. This has a fishing net and it's perfect for this coastal theme. I want this background to be two-toned, so I'm using some Distress ink. This is, I think it was tie-dyed that I used, and I ended up changing it and using some brushed corduroy. And I'm inking the flat side of my embossing folder. This is just going to give some extra color, and it's going to make it so that the raised areas are the original color of the cardstock and the recessed areas are a darker shade. So it's going to be a little bit like my posts where I have some lighter ropes on them and the posts themselves are darker. So that wasn't enough contrast for me. So I went in with some brushed corduroy and did that same thing, ink blending that embossing folder, making sure that that paper hadn't moved while I was doing my ink blending, closed it up, and then put it back through my embossing machine. And I like the contrast here much better. Now, because I missed my cardstock before going through, I am going to sit that aside and let that completely dry, just to make sure that it's totally dry when I start to assemble my card. While I'm waiting for that, I'm doing a little bit of ink blending on my logs here, and I'm using that same brushed corduroy. After that, I'm taking a little bit of Lost Shadow Distress ink and doing just a tiny little bit of ink blending around the other die cuts. I just want to add a touch of a shadow, so I'm being very light-handed. I don't want to be heavy-handed and have a lot of ink there. I just want to give it the illusion of some more dimension and depth. I have some black enamel accents here, and I'm using that just to give the seagull a glossy black eye. And I will set that aside to dry. And I love using that for my die cuts, especially my animal die cuts. It gives it some dimension as well as some shine. So for this one, I'm not actually using my full background here. I'm just going to use a circle portion of it. So this is the Stitched Edge Circles background. This is a new die release with Spellbinders and Lisa Horton. And this is going to create a circle that has a really cool stitched edge to it. So I'm going to cut this die like this, and it's going to cut a whole circle. And then there's a small or a thin inner circle die that I'm going to use inside of it with some white cardstock to create a frame for this. So I did cut my cardstock down. There's no point in having all of that excess cardstock going through that background. If you wanted, you could be more strategic with your cutting and make it so that you could cut another circle out of it. But I knew that I wanted this background cut down, and I had an idea of where I was going to go with it. But I did still create the entire stenciled background because really it didn't take a whole lot of time. Plus, I wanted to see how that whole background looked. This was the first time that I was using that background. So to use that inner circle die, I am taping it all in place on my white cardstock. I want to make sure it's not going to move, and I also want to make sure that I have a nice even circle for the frame around my stenciled background. So tape that in place, put that through the die cutting machine, and I actually cut it twice. I cut it a second time off screen so that I could have a little bit more dimension to that frame. And you can see how it created a really beautiful frame with some stitched edge detail. So once that background was completely dried, I used my new Spellbinders trimmer and I trimmed it down to 5 1/4 inches by 4 inches. So this is a little bit smaller than my A2 card base. So it's going to leave a white frame around it that's going to tie in well with that stitched edge circle frame that I have from my circle background, as well as the white from the different die cuts. So I'm going to use that same Bearly Art glue to glue it all together. And when you use it on an embossed background, you want to make sure that you have a decent amount of glue and make sure that you have a good amount on the recessed areas that are going to have contact with your card base. I put an acrylic block over top of it to make sure that everything stays nice and flat and has contact with that base while it's drying. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, I can glue my stitched circle frames to my stenciled circle. And I'm using another acrylic block to hold those pieces down and free up my hands to do some more assembling. And once all of those pieces are dry, I continue on with assembling the rest of my card. Now I can put that circle on there. Now you don't necessarily need to cut this down in a circle. I just thought it would give a little bit of a different look. And my other two cards are going to be using a full background with that stenciled image, and I wanted to share an idea where you use just part of it and have a little bit more background showing, especially if you only wanted to use the Oh Boy die set, which is the one that I'm using here, and not add any of the elements from the set sail or the guiding light die set. It's just another little way to combine different collections and different pieces. And to me, the stitch circle frame kind of looked a little bit like a porthole on the side of a boat. And I thought it would look great on top of that castaway or that fishing net embossed background. Now I took some walnut stain and did some more ink blending on those posts there. I realized that they weren't going to stand out as much as I wanted them to. So I added a darker brown so that it would stand out a little bit more from that background. I'm assembling my die cuts on top of my acrylic block just to get an idea where I want everything placed. And that way, when I move it to the side, I know exactly where I had everything placed, and it makes it really easy to know where I want to glue things. Now, sometimes when I'm doing this gluing process, I still tweak and move things around, but it just gives me a general idea, and it gives me a good idea of whether I like the placement I have in my head or whether I want to move something or something doesn't look quite right. So I'm going to use that same liquid glue. Now, because we have a bunch of different die cuts on top of each other, this background has a bunch of different levels. So by putting that acrylic block like I normally do to hold everything down to dry, it's got so many different levels that it doesn't really hold anything down. So off screen, I did for a few seconds hold some of the other pieces down with my hands. It usually takes maybe 10-15 seconds for that glue to start really grabbing, but I wanted to make sure that it did start grabbing so it had some contact there. I took some seagull die cuts and added them to the top left part of the circle there. It just seemed a little bit open and blank, so I liked the texture of those die cut seagulls, and I love the fact that one of the die sets has the flying seagulls in there. So that one was from the guiding light set, the lighthouse set, and they work perfectly in that background. So now for my next card, I'm doing that same thing that I did for the first card. I have a piece of 5.5 inch by 8.5 inch hammermill cardstock that I'm going to do my ink blending on for my background. I'm going to make the water here a little bit darker than my first one. This one I'm going to use the set sail, the boat on, and I want to have a little bit more of a vibrant background to it. So this time for my water, I'm using some tumbled glass first, and then I'm going in with some salty ocean. I'm using that same large blending brush that I used before. You could use a regular blending brush for this. These large ones just make it a little bit quicker and you cover a lot more area, but the final result doesn't look any different than the regular blending brushes. Same as the first one, I'm being a little bit heavier handed in some areas and lighter handed in others, just to get a little bit of color variation in my water. Now, using distress inks with these stencils makes it very, very easy to clean them off. I just rinse them off in water. I don't need to use anything special to clean them off. So it's one of the reasons why I do like to use dye inks when I'm doing some ink blending. You could use other inks if you want, but I love the look of these, and I love the fact that they're transparent. So if you do one color over another, you get a combination of the two colors. For the rocks here, I'm using Lost Shadow, and I'm also using that same color for the clouds. Now for the clouds, I'm not fully stenciling in that whole area. I'm just being a little bit heavy-handed on the bottom part of the cloud, just to get a little bit of a shadow. I don't necessarily want fully gray clouds. I just want to see the shadow on the bottom of it. So for the sky here, I'm using the speckled egg. This is just the lighter blue. And again, same as the first card, I want to make sure that I have a different color for my sky than I do for my water. I don't want those to blend together. So I am being light with the speckled egg here, and I can be a little bit heavier around the edges of it if I want to. But I can keep going back in and tweaking it and making it exactly how I want. I ended up deciding that it was a little bit too light around the edges, so I went in with some tumbled glass. Once again, not being quite as heavy as I was on my water, but still getting a little bit of color variation in that sky. You can see as I'm going through the different stencils here how easy they are to place and position. There's really not much time or effort that it takes to position them to know exactly where each one of them goes. And the sticky mat makes it really easy to press them in place and have them positioned. Like I said before, if you wanted to use a piece of cardstock that was smaller, like 4¼ by 5.5 inch, the size of the front of a card, you would have even more area from that stencil to stick down. And it wouldn't really matter which portion of the stencil you're using. Like I said, they're very easy to position and know what goes where. So this last stencil here, I used some hickory smoke. I was fairly light-handed with the clouds. I didn't want them getting too dark. And I'll be using that same hickory smoke for this layer here. And once again, I'm not going to be too heavy-handed with those clouds. And I'm concentrating that ink on the bottom part just for the shadow. And I'm going to have a little bit heavier hand here with the rocks on this stencil than I did on the last one. For the last stencil, I'm going to use that same hickory smoke for the birds in the sky. And then I'm going to use some Uncharted Mariner for the water, just giving it a little bit more deep color on it. Another option though would be use the same Salty Ocean that I used at the first stencil, but be heavier handed, because I used it on the outer edges of the water in the first stencil. I didn't use it in the center, but I really love the deep color of the Uncharted Mariner, and it works perfectly in the water here. Now I wanted to do this water a little bit different than I did the last one, so I'm not going to use the Stickles glitter gel for this. What I am going to do is I'm going to make my own shimmer mist. So I have a little mini mister and I have it filled with water, and I'm going to use some Mint Perfect Pearls. Add a little scoop of the Perfect Pearls in the water in the mini mister, close it and shake it up really, really well, and you've made your own shimmer mist. Now, Perfect Pearls has a binding agent in it, so this would not work the same for all mica powders. It just depends on whether they have a binding agent in it. If it doesn't, you'd have to add some gum arabic to make your own, but I love that the Perfect Pearls has it already in it. It makes it really easy to make your own shimmer mist. You can see there's a little bit of shimmer there. It really doesn't show up as much on camera as it does in real life. So I left that on the sticky mat to completely dry before taking it off. And the Perfect Pearls, the nice thing about it is you can just rinse it right off the stencils. It doesn't need any special cleaner as well. So this background here, I'm cutting it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I'm going to use the boat die cut on here, so I want to make sure that I have a decent amount of the sky as well as that water in order to make room for that boat. I absolutely love this background, and every time I make one, I keep spending time just looking at it. So now that I have that ready on the side, ready to go, I can assemble my die cuts. I'm going to do the same thing I did before, using that Barely Art glue in the fine line bottle. Because some of these die cuts are a little bit bigger, I am putting my acrylic block on them in between, gluing different pieces in place. This just frees up my hands, make sure everything is nice and flat, stays nice and flat. These pieces are really easy to see exactly where they go. And just like the first one, I did all the die cutting off screen. It's exactly the same method as the way I did the die cutting for the stitched edge circles. But when I'm using a lot of small pieces like this, it makes a great opportunity to use up cardstock scraps. And in doing that, you can have fun with some of the colors and color schemes. So I kept things fairly neutral for the boat and the frame, and then I went with a bright red for the sails. Now I put that one sail on first and then realized I needed to put this other one on before I put the other one on, because the first one on, because there's one corner, the right corner kind of goes a little bit over the right sail. But the nice thing about using liquid glue is it was easy enough to just pull it right off and then put the correct sail down first and then glue it in place. So for my waves here, I did die cut 2 of them. I'm only going to use 1, but I wasn't too sure if I wanted some ink blending on my waves or not. So I thought I would die cut 2, do ink blending on one of them, and then save the other one for another project. I end up using it on my 3rd card, so it doesn't go to waste. But it was easy enough to die cut 2 at the same time, or one after the other, and be able to pick and choose which look I liked better for the card that I was creating. So I'm using that same Uncharted Mariner that I used for the last color for the layering stencils, ink blending on top of that wave die cut before adding the white part to it. And just like I said at the beginning when I was assembling my first set of die cuts, there are some marks and indents that get put on this wave when you're die cutting that show you exactly where the white die cut pieces go, so you don't have to guess exactly where everything goes. It's very easy to know where the placement goes. So for my clouds, I'm going to add a little bit of shadow below them, so I'm just using some hickory smoke. I'm being fairly light-handed with the color here. Again, I just want a touch of shadow. I don't want them all stark white. The shadow underneath them makes them a little bit more realistic. Now this cloud here, it does layer on top of each other. I'm creating 3 different clouds. I'm going to use them separately, but you could layer them on top of each other if you wanted to, but it's nice to be able to use them both ways. Now that I have all my die cuts ready to go, I can start figuring out exactly where I want them placed on my card. So I have an A2 card base here that I have ready to go. I'm going to glue down my stenciled background. Then I'm going to put my acrylic block on there to hold it nice and flat while it is starting to dry. And as I started putting it down, I realized it needed something framing it. So I took a piece of black cardstock and just cut it down to 4 1/8 inch by 5 3/8 inch. So it's going to have just a tiny little black frame around it, but it's going to frame it nicely. It's also going to tie in with the black frame of my sailboat. It just needed something around it. It was a little bit too stark just all by itself. Another option would be a red to tie in with the red sails on the boat, or even a dark blue to tie in with the blue ink blending on the waves. Either way, just a little bit of a frame looks a lot nicer and finishes it off better. So while that is drying, I can figure out my placement for my different die cuts. I love being able to do this, and seeing it right on the background is very, very helpful. Now, I don't want to cover up all of those seagulls there, and I definitely don't want to cover up all of the clouds, but it's so handy to be able to see exactly how it's going to look on that background, and then just be able to lift it right off, keep my placement, and not remember where I had everything placed. So once I have a design I'm happy with, I can lift that off and start gluing those different die cuts in place. And I really love the look of those die cuts glued onto that stenciled background. It just gives it a little bit more texture and dimension. So you still have all of that detail from the stenciled background, but then you get the dimension of the die cuts. And even though the cloud styles are a little bit different, they still work. So I'll continue to glue all of my pieces down, and you can see how easy it is to work with the liquid glue in the fine tip bottle. It makes it really easy to just put on exactly how much glue is needed and not worry about getting too much and not worrying about that glue oozing out because there is too much. Now, the hardest die cut to place is this wave. I left it as is, but you could take your scissors and cut it down smaller if you wanted to, just to make it fit a little bit better. Now, I just didn't want to have the wave in front of my rock stenciling because it would have looked really, really weird. I had one lone seagull die cut left over from my last card, so I decided to add it to the left side of the card to balance out the seagulls that were on the right. I wanted to add a little bit more texture to my boat die cut, so I added some glossy accents in the window and then a little bit of stickles on top of the waves. Now, I only put it just a little tiny bit on the top. I don't want to overwhelm it with glitter, but I do love the extra texture and sparkle that it gives. And look at how beautiful that card turned out. I love the stenciled background with those die cuts. Now, I am keeping sentiments off of here. This line does have a set of stamped sentiments. I haven't received mine yet, so I'm going to add my sentiments when I do receive it. But you could easily turn that into a Father's Day card or a masculine card, or just perfect for someone that loves sailing or loves the ocean and coastal themed things. So for my third card, I'm going to do one with the lighthouse, and I'm going to create more of a sunset look. So I'm going to be heavier with my colors here and add in a little bit of oranges. So for my water here, I'm using tumbled glass and saltwater taffy just to add a little bit of that peachy coral color reflection in the water. Now, you could always leave this layer completely blue, and then when you go and do the last layer that has that reflection of the water, you could add that corally color then, but I'm going to add a little bit darker of the corally color at that point, and you'll see why. So next layer is the rocks and the clouds, and I'm going to do the lost shadow for this one. Again, light-handed because we've got those other layers coming in. And for the clouds, I'm going to do a little bit of the lost shadow, and then I'm going to add a little bit of some corally colors using some abandoned coral, but I don't want to mix my lost shadow with that abandoned coral. So I'm going to clean off the stencil with just a soft cloth. It doesn't need to be run under a tap or anything. Just getting that excess ink off is enough. And then I'm using a blending brush to put some of that abandoned coral on there. And just like I did with the lost shadow, I'm only concentrating on the lower part of the clouds. It's going to reflect off of the sun that we're going to add to the sky in just a little bit. I also added a little bit of shaded lilac. I love when you get sunset skies that have the corally colors with also a touch of purpley or lilac colors. I think it looks really cool, so I decided to add a little bit of that as well. And that I did more on the top of the cloud so that it didn't blend too much with that abandoned coral. Now, like I just said, I wanted to add a sun to my sky, and I thought it would be perfect to go above where the reflection or that last stencil is. So I'm positioning my masking magic. I punched a hole in the center. You could also use a circle die to die cut a hole in the center. And I lightly place it on there, put that 6th stencil on there just to make sure that I had the correct positioning. And then I'm using that abandoned coral for the sun. I'm being heavier on the outer side of that sun than I am on the inside of it. And then the inside part of that circle that I die cut, I'm going to put that right on top to protect that orange. For the sky, I'm going to use some of that tumbled glass as well as the saltwater taffy. So these are the same 2 colors that I used on the water. I'm going to be a little bit lighter handed. Again, I don't want the water and the sky blending together. I want to have a little bit or 2 different shades of those colors. So I am being light-handed with it. I did take my painter's tape and taped the top part of the stencil because it was moving around a little bit, and that just held it a little bit more securely. And just like the times before when I've used the stencil, I'm being heavier handed on the outsides of the image rather than the center. The center, I want to keep that saltwater taffy to go right around that sun. I don't want to use the abandoned coral again because it's so bright. By using the saltwater taffy, I have a little bit more control. I can get it a little bit better blended in with that tumbled glass. And I don't have to worry about the sky part totally blending in with my sun or the abandoned coral that I got on my clouds. I also want to add just a touch of that shaded lilac to the sky. So I'm using a blending brush and trying to be as light-handed with it as possible. It really depends on how much ink you have on your brush as to how heavy it's going to be. You can always take some of the excess ink off on a scrap piece of paper. But after I put that on there, I went back with my tumbled glass and just ink blended a little bit over that shaded lilac just to make it a little bit more on the blue side. Now there's an endless color combination that you can use to create your sky like this. I thought a sunset in the background would be perfect to go with the lighthouse die cut. And I also wanted to show some variations of color combinations using this stencil. So with that layer done, I'm taking my mask off of my sun because I don't want my clouds to appear like they're behind the sun. I want the sun to appear like it's behind the clouds. And if I were to leave that mask on there, it would mask off that lower part of the sun on the clouds and it would mess with the perspective. So I'm using Lost Shadow once again, putting that on the bottom side of the clouds and then a little tiny bit of that abandoned coral. This time I'm putting it on the top of the clouds because that sun is above those clouds. So the reflection or that light, that color would be above the clouds. And then I'm putting a touch of that shaded lilac on the bottom right where I put the Lost Shadow. And for the next stencil, I'm going to repeat that same step with that cloud there. And I'm using that Lost Shadow on the rocks. I'm just being a little bit heavier handed on the rocks, light handed on the clouds, but I'm still using that shaded lilac as well as that abandoned coral just to get those colors in there similar to the cloud layer before this. And anytime between the different colors, you can use a soft cloth to wipe off the excess color of the stencil just to keep it a little bit more crisp and pristine. My last stencil here, I'm going to use some hickory smoke for those birds, make them nice and dark against that bright sky. And then I'm going to use that abandoned coral for my sun reflection in the water. And I'm being pretty heavy-handed with this color, especially at the horizon line. I'll be a little bit lighter-handed around those rocks there, and I wanted to have that abandoned coral as well as the tumbled glass close to the rocks, especially those ripples that are behind the rocks and the sun reflection wouldn't necessarily really get to. So there is my finished background there. I absolutely love these colors and the difference it makes compared to the first 2 backgrounds. So you can really get creative with your color choices. And those masks created out of Masking Magic, I just keep them, I'll keep them with my layering stencil set. And that way, if I ever want to do this again, I have those pieces all ready to go. So I can take my background here, I'm going to cut it down with my guillotine trimmer. Now I want my lighthouse to be on the right side of my panel. So I'm making sure not to cut off very much of that panel. And I'm cutting it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 again. I'm also going to put a black mat behind that, same as I did for my last card. It's going to frame it nicely, and it's also going to tie in with the black accents that I have die cut for my lighthouse. So once again, I have all of my pieces die cut, ready to go and ready to just layer together. And again, they're very easy to layer all the pieces together, especially these rocks. There's only 2 pieces to them, and the edges work well and make it effortless to know exactly what pieces go where. I wanted my lighthouse to have a little bit more dimension to it, so I cut 2 of the base and glued them together before starting to add the different accents. And just like the die cuts before, there are little score marks or little indentation marks on that die cut. They're really hard to see on screen, but it shows you exactly where those pieces go. So there's very little guesswork. You can easily see where those pieces fit in. Now I did my coloring really simple and very close to the front of the die packaging. I loved those red stripes on there, but I think it would also look great with some gray stripes going up it as well. For the flame in the top of the lighthouse, I just used my Inca Gold iridescent mirror cardstock. It's just a tiny little piece, and to be quite honest, it fits behind one of the bars in the top part, so you don't really see a whole lot. So in hindsight, you probably don't need to do this, or you could shift it over just slightly so that it's a little bit more visible. I just like the iridescent and how all the different colors show from it, and thought it would be good for that part of the lighthouse. And then when it came to the railing and the part beneath the railing, I wanted one of them in a matte silver and one of them in black, but I also wanted them to have a little bit of extra dimension. Those 2 pieces are on the same die, so I cut it once in silver and once in the black. And then when it came to layering, I did the railing with the black behind it and the silver in front, and the part that's beneath it, I did it with the black in front and the silver behind. So it has that extra dimension. I'm using up the die cuts that were created, and I will get that extra dimension when I put it on top of my lighthouse here. For some of these tiny little pieces like the windows, and there's just a couple accent trim pieces, the easiest way to get those on is using my tweezers to hold the die cuts while I add the glue to it. These tweezers are reverse tweezers, so if I happen to let go of the tweezers, I am not going to lose my die cut. I have to actually squeeze them to let go. So they're perfect for things like this, where you want to hold something, but you want to be able to swap it between your hands and not have to worry about holding those tweezers closed. Now I like to take these die cuts and assemble them off of my card with all of the different layers. And then once I am done and I have that die cut completely assembled and the glue is dried, I like to add it to my card then. But you could, if you were comfortable with it, you could glue all of these pieces together right on your card. You could just glue the base of the lighthouse and then add the pieces on it. But what I like to do is once I have my background on my card base, same as the other cards in this video, I like to lay my pieces on top of my acrylic block, being able to see that background and really see how that die cut is going to look finished on my card front. That way I have a little bit more wiggle room to move things and shimmy things. And if by chance the layout that I had planned at the beginning isn't going to work for some reason that I hadn't thought about ahead of time, I can adjust for that. So I'm going to use the wave that I created for the last one, but I really did like the ink blending on it. But because I have the white part of the waves already on there, I don't want to ink blend it while it's on my surface. I don't want to get any of the blue on the waves. So I just lifted it up, just put the edge of my brush along the bottom part of that wave there. Another option would be just to ink blend it the same way I did before, die cut an additional set of the white pieces of the waves and attach them on top of the pieces that are already glued there. But this worked perfectly for what I was going for. Now that I have all of my pieces ready, I'm ready to assemble the card. So I put that black mat on my A2 card base, then my ink blended stenciled background. Man, I just love all of the colors there. Now I can arrange things how I want them, make sure that all of the pieces that I have die cut are going to work the way I have it envisioned in my head. Now some of these pieces at the bottom, I'm going to have them off of my card. And once all of the pieces are completely dried, I'm going to glue, or I'm going to cut them off with some scissors. Now, for me, it doesn't matter that those pieces extend outside of my stenciled background. I think it adds a little bit more interest and something a little bit different to the card. But if that bothered you, what you could do is, instead of assembling or adding the mat to the card base plus the stenciled image, you could glue all your layers or assemble all your pieces on your stenciled background first, trim those pieces off, and then add the mat and the stenciled piece to the background of your card. Then you would have all of those die cuts within that image piece. But like I said, I enjoy the look of pieces extending past where you expect them to. So I'm also adding the seagulls from this die set. I cut them a couple times because I wanted to have options. I wanted to make sure I had enough seagulls, and I wanted to have more than just the two that are there. When you die cut them, it die cuts a big one and a small one, and I wanted to be able to just have a few of them on there. Like I said before, I really love the look of the die cut seagulls in combination with the stenciled ones. I think it makes it a little bit more interesting having them in a couple different colors as well as the dimension. So for the last steps on this card, I'm going to add just some streaks of stickles on the reflection of the water, especially that last stenciled part. And I'm also going to add a little bit to the top part of those waves there. This is just going to add some extra texture as well as sparkle. And I love that glitter texture on there. This is a great way because it doesn't take as long as it does for that to dry as the stickles from the very beginning. It's a great alternative to that. So here are the 3 cards created with this collection. Now, once again, remember there is a sentiment set, and I can't wait to add the sentiments to the cards. I'm just going to add them on the inside of the cards for these ones, but I love the coastal feel for them. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.